In a village where time forgot to pass, where secrets hang heavier than the mist, a single candlestick, bent, silent, watching, may reveal a truth no one dares speak. A body will fall, a lie will be unmasked, and behind it all, a truth that even Miss Marple may wish she hadn't uncovered. Stay with us through this full-length mystery experience, because in the final moments, the truth twists in a way even she didn't see coming. Before we turn the first page, hit the subscribe button, turn on notification so you won't miss our daily mystery. It's the best way to ensure you're with us for every chapter, and every revelation. Chapter 1. The Quiet of Elmwick. Ah, Elmwick. There are villages in England that wear their histories like a starched collar, tight, formal, unmistakable. And then there is Elmwick, a place where the past doesn't so much announce itself as it lingers, quietly, beneath the moss-covered stones and the sighing hedgerows. It is a village untouched by time, or so the locals say, though time has certainly touched it. It has simply chosen to do so, with velvet gloves, and in secret. It was early autumn when Miss Marple arrived, the kind of autumn that glows gold for only a moment, before folding itself into grey. The trees along the railway path burned with fading leaves, amber and rust in quiet conversation with the mist that rose from the earth. Trains here came infrequently, and when they did, they moved not with urgency, but with the dignity of an old memory, important not for where it took you, but for who you might find when you arrived. She stepped off the platform with a quiet nod to the porter, her gloved hand gently adjusting the brim of her hat, her carpet bag, a sturdy floral thing, dangling with well-worn comfort from her wrist. Miss Marple, though elderly, walked with a deliberate grace, every step betraying the curiosity of a mind that never truly rested. She had come to Elmwick for peace, as she often said, but peace was something that, curiously, never quite followed her where she went. AGATHA Trenwith had invited her, of course, a distant cousin, the sort of relation one does not see for decades, then remembers fondly in moments of sudden loneliness. Agatha's letter had been neatly written, its tone a blend of stoicism and something unsaid. There was always something unsaid with AGATHA Trenwith. Her handwriting spoke of careful posture, and her paper had smelled faintly of dried violets and locked rooms. Elmwick Manor itself stood on a modest rise, just beyond the village proper. It was not grand in the way some ancestral homes are grand. It did not boast marble halls or tapestries, but it had a gravity all its own. Red brick, turned black with weather, ivy grown like old secrets along its western face, and windows that even in sunlight refused to gleam. And behind it, nestled beneath the ancient oaks, stood the chapel. Ah yes, the chapel. Not a place of worship, at least not anymore. No vicar had preached there in 2 generations. Its stone walls had buckled ever so slightly, as though sighing under the weight of too many confessions, and its roof, once proud with slate, had slouched just enough to make visitors uneasy. But it was not the chapel's architecture that drew murmurs at tea, or hesitant glances from villagers. It was the pair of crooked candlesticks that stood upon its altar, brass and unremarkable in design, but bent, curved unnaturally, as though melted by some hand unseen, one leaning toward the floor, the other straining sideways, like silent witnesses to something no one dared speak of. No one in the house touched them. That much was made clear to Miss Marple before she even stepped through the threshold. It's just old family nonsense, Agatha had said, her voice brittle as bone china. But one doesn't disturb what's settled, you see. Agatha herself was much as Jane remembered, tall, composed, dressed in heavy wool, even when the room was warm, and with eyes that missed nothing yet never betrayed their conclusions. She was the kind of woman who made silence feel intentional. Julian Trenwith, her only living heir, was another matter. Agitated, yes, but not without cause, one imagined. He paced as he spoke, rarely meeting one's eye for longer than necessary, and had the nervous habit of twisting his signet ring when asked even the most trivial of questions. He had the look of someone for whom rest was a foreign land, haunted not by ghosts, perhaps, but by the fear of their arrival. Then there was Eliza, the housemaid, though she seemed more a shadow than a servant. She spoke little, moved silently, and had the curious effect of vanishing from rooms the moment one's back was turned. Her hair was always tucked too tightly beneath her cap, and her sleeves always a touch too long, as though she were forever trying to shrink into the fabric of the walls. One might have mistaken her for being slow, but Miss Marple, who had learned that quiet did not equal dullness, suspected otherwise. The last to appear, though not least, was Reverend Vale, a tall willowy man, with a soft voice, and thinning hair, that he combed as though it still obeyed him. He was not the chapel's clergyman, there was none, but he presided over Elmwick's parish, and had by default, become its spiritual custodian. He spoke in verses, as some do, quoting scripture like punctuation, yet there was something in his gaze, something tremulous, like a man who'd read too many secrets, between the lines of holy books. The first evening passed as such evenings do, with polite conversation, lukewarm tea, and a sense that nothing could possibly go wrong, though something already had. Miss Marple found herself unusually restless, not in body, her needlework kept her hands content, but in thought. Something was not quite right at Elmwick Manor, though she could not have said what. It was not in what was said, but in what was left out. In the glances exchanged when Julian mentioned repairs to the chapel, in the way Eliza flinched at the toll of the grandfather clock, in the way the air changed ever so slightly, whenever the topic of the candlesticks was skirted, like a step avoided on a staircase known to creak. She took to walking the grounds before bed, claiming the fresh air did her joints some good. The staff pretended not to notice, and Agatha never questioned it. On the second night, as mist slithered across the hedgerows, and the moon carved pale corridors through the trees, she found herself near the chapel, and there it stood, silent, watchful, as though it waited not for prayer, but for an answer to a question no one had yet dared ask. The candlesticks could be seen through the chapel's arched window, barely, just a flicker of brass in the moonlight, their crooked forms unmistakable, even from a distance. They looked less like objects now, and more like sentries, guardians of something too long hidden. She turned to leave, unsure why her breath had caught, and that was when she saw it. A figure, moving, inside the chapel. There was no light, none, but she saw it. Just a silhouette, a shift, a motion out of place in the stillness. No one was supposed to be there. The door had been locked, and yet, Miss Marple did not rush toward the chapel. She was far too seasoned for that. Haste, after all, is the privilege of the inexperienced. Those who believe a mystery unravels more swiftly, if one simply runs at it. No, she stood quite still, her back ever so slightly straighter than before, her eyes narrowed not with fear, but with calculation, observing the stillness now returned, wondering if the movement had indeed occurred, or if she had conjured it in the half-silvered haze of moonlight and memory. But there again, a flicker, not movement this time, but change. The left candlestick, the one that leaned sharply downward, almost as if in mourning, seemed now to point more severely than it had before, almost accusatory. Of course candlesticks do not move themselves, and certainly not within the span of an hour, but there it was, bent more deeply, unmistakably, as if having shifted to gesture towards something hidden, beneath the chapel's uneven floorboards. The silence was deep, not empty. No, the silence was watching. Miss Marple remained outside for several minutes longer, long enough for any figure within to have emerged if they meant to. None did, and when she tested the chapel door, more from habit than hope, she found it secured, locked with a rusted bolt too old to deceive her eye. It had not been opened that night, not by ordinary means, and yet she had seen someone, she was certain. Or had she? Returning to her room, she said nothing, not to Agatha, who had already retired with a book she would not finish, nor to Julian, who had lingered in the drawing room, sipping brandy he did not enjoy, and staring into the hearth, as though hoping it might reveal something. No, she said nothing. But that night, Miss Marple did not sleep, not entirely. Her mind wandered corridors, her feet did not, retracing the figure in the chapel, the shifted candlestick, the unspoken weight that hung about the manor like a veil, never lifted. In the days that followed, the village of Elmwick maintained its quaint illusions with admirable consistency. The grocer still greeted each passerby with a nod, timed precisely to the chime of the clock tower. Children played on cobblestones smoothed by centuries, and the air carried that faint, perpetual scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. To the outsider, it was a postcard, a relic untouched. But Miss Marple was not an outsider, in the usual sense. She was, in fact, something rather more dangerous, an observer. One who listened to things not said, who noticed when footsteps paused just a moment too long outside closed doors, who marked the precise moments in conversation when eyes looked away. And as the days wore on, Elmwick's perfection began to crumble, not in catastrophe, but in the small, almost invisible details that only the truly watchful perceive. Julian, for instance, became more withdrawn. Where once he had been restless, he now became avoidant. He rarely left the estate, except once to the chapel, and even then he returned with his coat collar turned high, and his eyes unfocused, as though he had looked too long at something he could not understand. He ceased to eat meals with the household, claiming headaches, and Miss Marple noticed, with quiet dismay, that he had begun locking his bedroom door at night. Eliza, too, changed. Her silence grew heavier, her eyes flicked more often toward the windows, and on one occasion, Miss Marple found her standing quite still in the corridor, one hand pressed flat against the wall, as though listening to something beyond it. When asked what she was doing, the girl said nothing. She simply turned and left. And Agatha, well, Agatha continued her performance with admirable tenacity. Tea was still served precisely at 4, the silver was polished, and her conversation was as clipped and proper as ever. But her hands, Miss Marple noticed, trembled slightly when she reached for the sugar tongs, and one afternoon, while adjusting a cushion that needed no adjusting, she murmured, quite softly, and to no one in particular, "I told him not to go in there." Miss Marple did not interrupt. She knew the mind often gave up more to silence than to interrogation. It was during these strange days that the chapel became more than a curiosity. The villagers avoided it openly now, some even crossing the road to pass by it. A few whispered of sounds, unexplained, echoes beneath the stone, a low murmuring like voices heard through walls too thick to penetrate. And then on the 5th evening of Miss Marple's stay, a small event occurred. Small, yet profoundly unsettling. The crooked candlestick, yes, the left one, always the left, was discovered not in its usual place upon the chapel altar, but standing, quite deliberately, upon the windowsill of the drawing room. No one admitted to moving it. Not Agatha, who gasped and crossed herself when she saw it. Not Julian, who turned pale, and refused to enter the room thereafter. And certainly not Eliza, who when asked, whispered only, "It shouldn't be here. It shouldn't ever leave that place." Miss Marple examined the candlestick carefully. It was heavier than it appeared, aged and pitted, yet clearly crafted with intention. The bend was unnatural, impossible to achieve without melting or brute force, and yet there were no signs of either. It seemed to twist of its own volition, like a body recoiling from unseen harm. That night, she dreamt of wax dripping upward. The next morning, the candlestick was gone. No one claimed to have moved it. The drawing-room window had been unlatched from within, and outside, beneath the hedgerow, were footprints in the dew, bare, slender, and facing the chapel. And so the first week passed, not in grand events or great revelations, but in that slow, deliberate unpeeling of atmosphere that so often accompanies houses with long memories and villagers who speak in half-formed warnings. Elmwick had not changed. It had simply shown itself as it truly was. Miss Marple, for all her age and softness, was not easily shaken, but even she now felt it, the delicate pressure of something lying beneath the surface of things, a tension that whispered rather than shouted, that left fingerprints not on glass but on thought. Let us consider what had unfolded. A chapel once holy, now merely haunted by memory. 2 candlesticks, bent as though warped by guilt, or heat, or something older still. A matriarch, who sipped tea with trembling fingers. A young man whose restlessness had turned inward, into fear. A maid whose silence was not born of ignorance, but of long knowledge. A priest whose words comforted no one, least of all himself. And a guest, Miss Marple, who had not come to solve anything, but now found herself unable to look away. Each figure in this house played their role with subtle precision, but it was the candlesticks, silent, inanimate, yet never quite still, that seemed to watch them all. They moved, though no one moved them. They pointed, though no one asked to be shown. They existed not as objects, but as reminders of something unspoken, unresolved, and unwilling to stay buried. The footprints in the dew, bare, human, delicate, were not explained, nor was the appearance and disappearance of the bent candlestick from the drawing room. No one confessed, though all eyes betrayed unease. And when Miss Marple rose early the next morning, and returned to the chapel window, she noticed something that had not been there before. A scratch, shallow, but deliberate, etched into the stone just below the windowsill. It was a word, half erased by weather, smudged by time, and nearly gone, but not quite. Forgive, just that. No subject, no explanation, only that cold command, hanging there like a whisper from some long-gone throat. Miss Marple said nothing to anyone. Not yet. She simply turned away, her mind already weaving threads no one else could see, because behind the lace curtains, and the polite conversations, behind the silver trays, and the pressed linens, something was growing, something with old roots, something twisted and hidden, and patient, and she could feel it. She could feel that what had begun here was not simply odd or curious, it was dangerous, in a quiet and careful way, and that perhaps the crooked candlesticks were not warning signs, but invitations, beckoning her closer to something that did not want to remain hidden any longer. That night, the wind rose in Elmwick, trees bowed, windows rattled. Somewhere in the chapel, a door that should have stayed shut creaked slowly open, and at the stroke of midnight, as the house settled into a silence far too deep for dreams, Miss Marple looked from her window, and saw it again. A figure, barely visible, standing inside the chapel, motionless, facing the altar. No light, no sound, no reason, and when she looked more closely, pressing gently against the cold glass, she saw that the figure was looking back. But the chapel, of course, was supposed to be empty, and the door, of course, was still locked. Elmwick had promised her peace. It had given her a puzzle instead, and though she did not yet know what the crooked candlesticks meant, she knew, without question, that they were only the beginning. If you've enjoyed this first chapter, and wish to continue unraveling the mystery with Miss Marple, I invite you to subscribe. New chapters await full of secrets, yet to be uncovered. Chapter 2. Death by Candle. There is a peculiar weight to certain mornings, those that arrive not merely with sunlight, but with the quiet suggestion that something has changed while the world was sleeping. Elmwick, on this particular morning, seemed to breathe differently. The trees stood too still, the air hung too thick, and the usual rustle of life, the shuffle of boots on cobblestone, the distant clink of teacups behind lace-curtained windows, was strangely absent, as though the village itself were holding its breath. And yet, on the surface, all was as it had been. The manor's garden glistened with dew. The crows cawed from their posts atop the old oak trees. The church bell, one cracked slightly at the rim, prepared for its lazy chime. But inside Elmwick Manor, a terrible hush had taken root, and it began not with a bang or a crash, but with a scream. It echoed first through the eastern corridor, sharp, brief, utterly out of place. By the time Miss Marple reached the door, robe cinched neatly, eyes clear despite the early hour, Eliza was already there, collapsed against the frame, pale as the pressed linens in the guest rooms, her mouth forming words that failed to emerge. Her hand pointed, not toward the drawing room or the kitchen, but beyond, to the chapel. Miss Marple did not ask questions then. She nodded, ever so slightly, and walked one step, then another, along the gravel path toward the little chapel, nestled behind the hedgerows. The grass was wet, untouched, but for a set of faint footprints, barefoot, no less, leading toward the door. It was locked. Agatha appeared next, shawl clutched tightly, reverend veil close behind her, offering murmured prayers no one quite listened to. It took time, as these things often do, for the groundskeeper to arrive with a rusted ring of keys and trembling hands, and when the door finally creaked open, its hinges protesting like an old man's knees, the scene inside was revealed in its entirety. There, in the glowless morning light, filtering through the high stained glass window, lay Julian Trenwith, still, composed, and entirely wrong. At first glance, it might have seemed peaceful. His body was arranged almost delicately, as though he had simply sat down to rest and allowed the world to fade. His eyes were closed, mouth neither twisted in agony nor frozen in shock. But it was his hands. Oh, his hands, that betrayed the unnatural truth. Across both palms, over the knuckles and down the wrists, lay thick trails of hardened wax, pale and glistening like cooled tears, as if poured directly from the crooked candlestick, now leaning ominously beside him. And yes, it was the same one. The left candlestick, warped so strangely, now bent even further than before. Its brass form seemed twisted, not by time or accident, but by intention, curving downward now, like a hand pointing to the very spot where Julian had fallen. Miss Marple said nothing at first. She merely observed. The details whispered to her, as they always did. The fact that there were no candles lit, and yet melted wax abounded, the absence of soot or any scent of smoke, the precise way the body was positioned, as if for an audience, the faint scuff marks beneath Julian's heels, suggesting he had not merely collapsed, but been arranged. More curious still, was the door, locked from the inside, without signs of tampering, no windows broken, no tools discarded, and the second candlestick, the right one, straight and unremarkable, was gone. Reverend Vale mumbled something about the curse of the Trenwith candlesticks, a phrase that passed quickly among the few onlookers, fluttering from tongue to tongue like dust disturbed by wind. Agatha's expression, though composed, seemed aged by years in a matter of moments. She looked not at her son, but at the candlestick, her lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a memory. The constable, summoned by mid-morning, was a young man named Pritchard, earnest, decent, and utterly overwhelmed. He made notes with excessive seriousness, pacing in circles, occasionally glancing at Miss Marple, as though half hoping she might solve it all for him, which she, politely, did not. But she did ask to see Julian's bedroom. Pritchard, more respectful than suspicious, agreed, and there neatly folded clothes, a diary, with half its pages torn out, a single half-written note in his hand. Miss Marple found her first true clue. The note, so short it barely justified the name, read only, "Forgive me, but forgive whom? For what?" On the writing desk lay a fresh matchbox. One was missing. She opened the hearth, and sifted gently through the cold ashes. A single match, unused, lay atop a clump of blackened paper. Why strike no flame in the fire, but bring wax to one's own hands in the chapel? She asked the constable to check the soles of Julian's shoes. They were dry, yet Eliza had seen him walking across the wet grass, barefoot. Miss Marple returned to the chapel, late that afternoon, alone. The candlestick had been moved into the vestry by then, though not by her doing. She stood by the altar, and examined the floor. No blood, no shards, no scent of oil, or candle smoke. And then behind the pulpit, she found it, the second candlestick, the straight one, tucked away as though hidden. Why stage a scene with only one? Why arrange the left to look more bent, more accusatory, more cursed? And why was Julian barefoot? Questions, all questions, but already, a shape was forming in her mind. The scene, she knew, had been staged. The wax, the door, the positioning. It had all been constructed to look like something else. She didn't know what yet, but she knew why. Because someone in the house, or perhaps beyond it, wanted the story to write itself. They wanted those who entered the chapel to see the body and say, "Ah yes, of course it was the candlestick. It was the curse." But Miss Marple, as ever, saw past the story, and into the hands that held the pen. And though she said nothing to the constable, and nothing to Agatha, she did stop Eliza, on the way back to the house, and softly, she asked, "You saw him leave last night?" The girl nodded. "Through the window. Were you watching for him?" Eliza hesitated. Her lips parted, then closed, and that silence, that singular hesitation, spoke volumes. That night, the house stood unusually still, as if exhausted by the weight of its own secrets. Even the clocks seemed subdued in their ticking, chiming not with the confidence of habit, but with the hesitance of guilt. Tea had been served, untouched. Agatha retreated early, citing a headache, and Eliza did not emerge from her quarters again, though Miss Marple doubted she had slept even a moment. The wind outside picked up, not storming, no, not yet, but murmuring through the trees like someone remembering an old story, one with an ending they dared not speak aloud. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, beside the fire that had not quite taken. The flames flickered nervously, unable to commit, as if aware of the quiet scrutiny in her gaze. She was not knitting, nor was she reading. She was thinking, reviewing. There had been bare feet, yet no mud tracked beyond the chapel threshold. There had been wax, but no candle ever lit. There had been a locked door, but too easily forced, too conveniently closed. And above all else, there had been fear, deep, silent fear, in the eyes of everyone she spoke with that day. A fear that went beyond mourning or shock. Fear of being watched, of being found out, of old things returning. What fascinated her most, perhaps, was not Julian's final message, or what little was left of it, but rather the emotion behind it. Forgive me. It was not defiance, not despair. It was apology, guilt. Yes, but for what, and to whom? She rose from her seat just past midnight, footsteps muffled by the thick manor rugs. With practiced quiet, she moved not toward the chapel this time, but toward the narrow back staircase near the pantry, the one few guests knew about, but which Eliza had used often in the past. It was unlit, but her fingers found the banister easily, tracing its gentle slope downward, until she reached the rear hallway, where the servants' quarters branched off in a narrow L. The door to Eliza's room was ajar. Inside, a single candle burned low in a chipped porcelain holder. On the wall above the bed hung a faded photograph, one Miss Marple had not seen before, of a younger Julian, perhaps 9 or 10, standing beside a child, just a little smaller, a girl with long dark hair, and a stiff, unreadable expression. Not a sister. No such child had ever been mentioned. Below the photo, a folded note lay on the dressing table, and beside it, a small brass wax seal stamp. Miss Marple did not touch it. She did not need to. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in revelation, an understanding that sat just out of reach, like the final corner of a jigsaw still face down on the table. She returned to her room shortly after, and sat by the window overlooking the chapel, watching it as one watches a stage long after the actors have gone. She waited, and at precisely 2:14 in the morning, the chapel door, still broken from the morning's forceful entry, creaked open, just an inch, no more. She did not move, she simply watched, and the wind, which had played only at the eaves until now, rose gently into a low whistle, curling through the trees and carrying something almost musical with it. A note, a hum, or perhaps it was merely in her imagination, but imagination, Miss Marple knew, often has impeccable timing. By morning, the door had closed again. Pritchard, the constable, returned to announce that Julian's cause of death could not be confirmed without further investigation. There were no toxins found, no head trauma, no visible cause beyond the wax, which was not enough. A mystery without evidence, he called it. But Miss Marple had already begun to collect a different kind of evidence. Small things, glances, hesitations, absences where people ought to be, and presences in places no one should go. Her theories were not yet firm, but she had gathered the perimeter of a truth that waited patiently in the center, like a snake curled beneath a rug. Agatha remained aloof, her expressions clipped into civility, her grief tempered by control, but she made no mention of funeral arrangements. None of the staff were dismissed. The day moved forward with mechanical resolve, as if Julian had simply stepped out for the afternoon, and was expected to return by supper. Reverend Vale offered a reading, Ecclesiastes of course, and muttered something about candlelight revealing all things in time. It was an odd phrase, said with less conviction than habit, and it stuck with Miss Marple, long after he had left the manor. Late that afternoon, as the village fell back into its rhythm, a small boy, no older than 7, approached the chapel fence. Miss Marple observed from the path. The boy pointed to the steeple, and said to no one in particular, "That's where the lady stands. She watches with her hands all melted." His mother, red-faced and flustered, yanked him away before further explanation could follow. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, and opened Julian's torn diary once more. Beneath the ripped page, hidden in the seam of the spine, she found a single pressed flower, dead heather, dried perfectly. It meant nothing, and yet it meant everything. She stared at it for a long time, her thoughts moving like fog through trees, uncertain where they began or ended. Outside, the wind returned, and somewhere deep within the chapel, a single note of pressure built behind the altar stones, not a sound, but a tension, the kind one feels rather than hears. The case, she now understood, had not truly begun until that moment. Chapter 3. Secrets. of the family Bible. It was on the fourth morning, after Julian's disappearance from life, that the house once again exhaled, reluctantly, as though holding its breath for just one moment longer might prevent something else from surfacing. The air in Elmwick had grown colder, not biting, but alert, and the walls of the manor, so long steeped in quiet restraint, now seemed to lean ever so slightly inwards, as if listening to something that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. Sleep, these days, arrived with less conviction and fled with haste, leaving in its wake the residue of impressions and fragments, a child's photograph she had never seen, a warped brass shadow bending towards stone, and Julian's unfinished note echoing faintly through her mind. Only crooked light can show straight sin. She had pondered it in silence, not a poetic whim. No, a cipher of some kind. Surely, a memory encoded in metaphor. She dressed deliberately that morning, not in mourning black, which Agatha had insisted was unnecessary, but in soft grey tweed, the kind one might wear to a courtroom or a long journey. There was something judicial in her bearing today, something resolved. Downstairs, the staff moved like echoes of themselves. No one had yet asked about the funeral. No one dared speak Julian's name, except in brief, breathless questions, muttered into tea or behind closed pantry doors. Miss Marple noticed, too, that the fire in the drawing room had not been lit the night before. It had been laid, yes, but not lit, almost as if someone had intended to burn something and changed their mind. She crossed the foyer, turned left at the grandfather clock that had resumed its ticking with a sudden vengeance, and entered the study. It had once belonged to Agatha's husband, she presumed, the sort of man who collected atlases he never opened and inkwells too elegant to stain. It smelled faintly of paper, dust, and masculine regrets. There, tucked in the lower left drawer of the bureau, she found it, the Trenwith family Bible. She had not searched for it explicitly. She had asked, once, gently, and Agatha had waved the suggestion off with a dismissive flick of the hand. It's all there, of course. Old dates, marriages, the usual, nothing of use. But Miss Marple, who had long since learned that nothing of use often meant something someone would rather forget, waited for the house to turn its eyes elsewhere. And now, with the soft creak of leather binding and the faintest breath of parchment, she opened the book to its first page. The genealogy entries were formal, names written in ink that faded by generation, marriages dated with curlicues, baptisms recorded in full, down to the clergyman's name. There were at least 7 generations, most straightforward, until one turned the page to the present era. There it changed. Names grew more tentative, dates appeared without context. There was a child, Clara Evelyn Trenwith, born in 1919. No marriage followed, no death recorded either. Only her name, nestled in between Julian's and another child whose name had been violently erased, the parchment beneath it, scored and rough, the remaining space left unfilled. Julian's name was written clearly, Julian Marcus Trenwith, born 1924, Elmwick, and beneath it, a faint indentation. Another name had been there once, but now it was gone. She leaned in, ran her gloved finger over the damaged vellum. There was a ghost of a name, something beginning with C. The ink had been scrubbed, the kind of work done not in haste, but with firm, exacting intent. She closed the Bible slowly, lips pressed in thought, but before replacing it, she turned to the final page, where one often finds forgotten flowers or ribbon bookmarks left by sentimental ancestors. Instead, she found a single quote, written in Julian's unmistakable hand. Only crooked light can show straight sin. Miss Marple sat back in the leather chair. The phrase was no longer poetic. It was an accusation, or worse, a confession. And Julian, wherever his mind had wandered in those last hours, had written it, not in his diary, nor in a letter, but here, in the family's most sacred text, which meant he wanted someone to find it, and that someone had to be her. Later that afternoon, the manor seemed to pulse with an odd kind of hush, not silence, precisely, but something heavier, as though the walls had absorbed too many stories, and now struggled to keep them contained. Miss Marple sat briefly with Agatha in the conservatory, where the dying autumn sunlight painted the ivy in shades of ochre and ash. The air smelled faintly of overripe fruit, mingled with the waxy scent of long unlit candles, and when Agatha spoke, it was with the brittle cheer of someone struggling to keep herself from vanishing beneath the surface of her own legacy. "You've been in the study," Agatha said. "I have. And the Bible. I found it quite informative." There was a pause, not long, but long enough for meaning to stretch itself between them. "I used to read it aloud during the war," Agatha said, voice almost fond, "to Julian and the others, before everything changed, before things became delicate." Delicate, a curious word. Miss Marple said nothing. Words were unnecessary, sometimes. That evening, Eliza collapsed again. It happened during supper, just as the second course was being served, pheasant, if memory served, and without warning. Her hands began to tremble, her throat tightened, and then she was on the floor, murmuring something too faint to catch. But Miss Marple heard enough. "Not again, not the chapel. She's not gone. She's not gone." The doctor was summoned once more, his prescription unchanged, but Miss Marple took it upon herself, gently, to sit with the girl as the others returned to the dining room. It was in that moment, those quiet minutes between dusk and full dark, that Eliza finally spoke. Really spoke. Her voice was small, but there was force behind it, like water pressing at the walls of a locked room. "She used to stand behind the candlesticks," Eliza said, staring at the ceiling. "Back when the chapel had curtains. We weren't meant to see her, but I did. Once. Just once." "Who did you see, Eliza?" The girl shook her head. "Not a name. Not really. Just a shape." And then the bending started. "They were straight, miss. Once. Both of them." Miss Marple's breath caught, but did not interrupt. She touched one, and it bent. Bent like it was soft, like it wanted to follow her. "Then they said she'd gone away. But I think she's still here." "And who is she?" Eliza closed her eyes. "The missing one." At dawn, the chapel was empty. Miss Marple had woken early, earlier than usual, and crossed the dew-covered lawn in her heeled shoes without hesitation. The door, which had been bolted the day before, now hung slightly ajar. The chapel's interior, dim as ever, seemed expectant, as though something had just departed. But it wasn't the door that troubled her. It was the altar, for there, where two candlesticks had always stood, even crooked, even cursed, there was now only one. The bent candlestick remained. The straight one, perfect, untouched, was gone. Miss Marple looked not just at the altar, but beyond it. Her eyes followed the direction of the crooked stem, still leaning, now even more dramatically than before, as though it pointed once again toward something that had not yet been noticed. It pointed left, to the wall, and on that wall, faint but real, were 4 wax streaks, uneven drips dried to the stone, as though something had been carried too carelessly, or dragged. No footprints, no sounds, just absent, and the feeling that the chapel, though still, and stone cold, had recently witnessed something it would not confess. She returned to the house without speaking of it, not to Agatha, not to the constable, not even to the Reverend, who had begun appearing less frequently, his presence waning like candlelight before a storm. She returned instead to Julian's desk, to the place where his note had been found, and opened the lowest drawer. There, folded between 2 disused writing pads, was a second letter. This one, not in Julian's hand, finer, older. It read, "Clara cannot be allowed to return. She's too far gone." The chapel saw what she did, and the light turned against her. "If you see her again, if you hear her name, burn the book, and do not enter the chapel at night." Unsigned, undated. But it was not new, and it changed everything. The story is shifting. Who was Clara? Why did the chapel seek? And share your theory below. Chapter 4. The Housemaid's Tale. There are moments when the very air in a house change, not from heat, nor cold, nor storm on the horizon, but from something much quieter, much more precise, like a breath being held somewhere behind the walls. Elmwick Manor had begun holding its breath again. One could feel it in the way the doorknobs resisted turning, or how the floorboards, so willing to creak before, now seemed to hesitate, as if waiting to learn what came next before daring to react. Miss Marple noticed, as she always did. It was not just the absence of the second candlestick, or the fact that no one had yet spoken aloud the name Clara since she had discovered the unsigned note in Julian's desk. No, there was something else now. A weight not of secrets withheld, but of secrets preparing to emerge. It was Eliza who opened the gate. Late that night, the girl knocked softly at Miss Marple's door, not the knock of routine, but of confession. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in her housecoat, eyes rimmed with red, hands trembling, not from cold, but from the strain of remembering something long kept in its place. Miss Marple did not ask her to speak. She simply poured a cup of tea, motioned gently to the chair near the fire, and waited. "I've seen someone," Eliza whispered, the words brittle as frost. "Going down there." "Down where, dear?" Eliza swallowed. "The crypt, beneath the chapel, at night. I only saw the back of them, once maybe twice. I never followed, but I heard the gate. It makes a sound like teeth." Miss Marple blinked slowly. Elmwick's chapel, according to village law, had no crypt, or at least not one spoken of in polite company. But the old churches, especially those as ancient as this, were riddled with things forgotten: catacombs, stone staircases, buried rites, long abandoned, but never quite exorcised. "You saw this recently?" she asked. Eliza nodded. "Last week, and before that. Years ago, but then it stopped." Miss Marple sipped her tea, the scent of chamomile mingling with the cold in the room. Her voice was calm, almost kind. "What else did you see?" Eliza's gaze drifted toward the mirror above the hearth. Her reflection looked startled to be seen. "There used to be gatherings," she said. "Not crowds, just a few people. At night, in the drawing room, they'd cover the mirrors, move the chairs in a circle. There were words, strange ones, and the candlesticks were always there, always lit." Miss Marple did not flinch. "Seances." Eliza hesitated, then nodded. "That's what the Reverend called it. When I asked once, said it was only theatrics, said it was better left alone." "And did he attend?" A pause. "Yes. There are memories people suppress, and those they preserve." Eliza, it seemed, had done both at once, half forgetting, half reminding herself of something she had never understood, but had always feared. The mention of the candlesticks had triggered her episodes. The chapel induced panic. But now, freed from the constraint of keeping silent, the memories began to align. Miss Marple decided, the next morning, to return to the chapel, not with questions, with eyes. The crypt entrance was hidden, of that she was now certain, but not invisible, and so she traced the chapel floor, inch by inch, stone by stone, until her gloved fingers felt a depression near the altar, a hairline seam around a slab that bore no carvings, just wax, long cooled, old wax, pooling in unnatural symmetry. She fetched the Reverend, or rather, met him on the path just as he was returning. Reverend Vale looked older than he had the week before, not by age, but by the erosion of certainty. "I need to know what lies beneath," Miss Marple said, without theatrics, without tone. He looked away. "It's not been opened in decades," he muttered. "There's no key, just the bolt beneath the altar. Most have forgotten it's even there." "Not everyone. No, not everyone." Together, they returned. He moved aside the altar's frontal, revealing the bolt, rusted but intact, and turned it with visible reluctance. The stone lifted, not easily, but willingly, and beneath it, a staircase, spiraling into the dark, narrow, cramped, cold. Miss Marple descended first. The air was stale, touched by earth and time. At the base, the stairs gave way to a short passage of stone, uneven and blackened. She held a lantern, its light uncertain, casting tall shadows that retreated into the recesses like secrets. There, she saw them, wax trails, faint but unmistakable, ribbons of hardened wax winding along the floor, some as fresh as last week, others as old as decades, stretching toward a sealed wooden door, its edges warped from moisture and memory. She stepped closer, and there, in the stillness, the door breathed. The breath was not real, of course. Doors do not exhale, but something within that chamber, be it air displaced, memory disturbed, or presence awakened, had shifted when Miss Marple approached. The lantern's flame flickered sideways, and she stood quite still for a moment, listening not for sound, but for absence. Reverend Vale remained above. He had not descended. Claimed his knees wouldn't allow it. Miss Marple doubted his knees, in that moment, were the true barrier. She placed her hand on the door. It was cool to the touch, not damp, but preserved. Not locked, either. The latch lifted without resistance, though the wood groaned softly, like an old throat trying to recall a song. Inside, the chamber was smaller than expected, no more than 10 feet by 8, carved directly into the stone. It contained nothing elaborate, no coffins, no inscriptions, but against the far wall stood a wooden platform, waist-high, upon which rested a simple mirror, draped in a black cloth, and on the floor, a ring of wax, not random, a circle, melted into the stone, and at its center, a candlestick, not bent, not straight, but snapped cleanly in half. Miss Marple stepped forward, her breathing shallow. This was no forgotten crypt. It was a room meant for something watched. When she emerged some minutes later, Reverend Vale looked as though he had aged another decade in her absence. "There are things," he said quietly, "best left beneath the chapel." Miss Marple offered no response. She had seen enough to understand that Julian's note had been less confession than warning, that what had happened in this house had not begun with his final moments, and that whatever light he spoke of, crooked or not, had first touched this family, long before his birth. She returned to the house without drama, no announcement, no confrontation. Instead, she sought out the corridor just past the east wing, the one seldom used, where portraits hung crooked and light bulbs flickered without cause, and there, just above the wainscoting, she found it, a photograph, framed, dusty. It had been there before. She had passed it countless times, but only now, after the crypt, did she notice. The image was of the old chapel interior, pre-war perhaps. Before the rot and the fear, there were people seated inside, 5, maybe 6, arranged in a circle, and on the altar, clear and symmetrical, stood both candlesticks, straight, unbent. Miss Marple stared, and as she looked, something shifted. The photograph. It changed, not all at once, but subtly. The left candlestick began to tilt, not physically of course. The frame did not move. The paper did not curl, but its contents realigned. The candlestick was bent now, leaning, pointing. She blinked, and it bent further. She turned away, looked again. It was straight, again. That evening, she asked Agatha one question. Did Clara ever return to Elmwick? Agatha paled. Then Clara never left Elmwick, and nothing more. Miss Marple did not sleep that night. She sat in the drawing room instead, watching the fire that never quite caught, her eyes flicking between the flickering flames, and the heavy drapes over the French doors. Beyond them, she imagined the chapel standing still beneath the sky, its crypt now open, its wax now cold. The snapped candlestick had not been brought back, nor had the mirror, and upstairs, Eliza dreamt of candles, candles that bled, candles that whispered, candles that watched. What do you think Eliza saw beneath the chapel? What secrets are the candlesticks still hiding? Share your thoughts below, before the next chapter reveals something we may not be ready to see. Chapter 5. Wax and Whispers. She did not speak of the figure in the mirror. Miss Marple, after all, was not a woman prone to melodrama, but neither did she forget. She sat at her writing desk that evening, with her back to the glass, the fireplace crackling low in the hearth, and allowed her thoughts to unfold not as conclusions, but as threads, each drawn slowly, methodically, toward a center not yet revealed. The wax figures in the attic. Julian's voice, broken and breathless, confessing to something he feared more than scorn. The candlesticks, first bent, then missing, now broken in half, and the photographs that shifted ever so slightly when one looked long enough to notice. And beneath it all, the chapel. She remembered Eliza's words. She used to stand behind the candlesticks. I think she's still here. And then, Miss Marple remembered something else, something trivial. A hallway she had passed a dozen times, a painting crooked, always the same way, as though it refused to be righted. She rose quietly and stepped into the corridor. The light from the wall sconce flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the wallpaper. She found the painting, a pastoral scene, dull and unremarkable, save for one detail. In the background, a chapel, and in its window, the faintest outline of a woman in black. It could be nothing, it could be light, it could be the way brushstrokes, aged with varnish, or it could be something left behind by someone who had tried, very subtly, to say that what had happened at Elmwick Manor had not been performance, but ritual. She did not sleep. The next morning, she asked to see the Reverend again. He obliged, though reluctantly. They sat together beneath the autumn branches, the trees shedding their last colours with indifference, and for the first time, his voice trembled, not with age, but with recognition. I found something, Miss Marple said. Or rather, many things, and they all point to Clara. He said nothing. You said she never left. No, he admitted. But that doesn't mean she stayed. Miss Marple tilted her head. He continued, haltingly. Clara was different, gifted, we used to say. Not just theatrically, but spiritually. She felt things before they happened. She heard voices. And the family, rather than help her, encouraged it, made her the centerpiece of their little gatherings. She was a child. They thought it charming. And the seances, real enough, in her mind, invented by the others. But the more they faked, the more she believed. She started going to the chapel, at night, alone, said someone waited for her there. That someone wanted to fix the light. We stopped. She didn't. And what happened to her? We say she left. That's what Agatha says. That's what they all agreed upon. And what do you say? Reverend Vale looked down at his hands. I say, something stayed. Miss Marple returned to her room that evening, with only one goal: to listen again, to Julian's voice, to the whispers, to anything that might have gone unnoticed. She played the tape once more. They won't let me leave. She slowed the reel, listened frame by frame. They're watching, then behind the crackle, faint but undeniable, a sound, not a voice, a laughter, brief, childlike, and unmistakably female. She froze the reel, then looked up, and caught, in the edge of the mirror, the figure again, closer this time, still faceless, still watching, and then it was gone. The house is no longer silent. What do you believe Clara became? And why is she watching now? Leave your theory below, before the next chapter draws her even nearer. Chapter 6. Letters Never Sent. There is a peculiar kind of heaviness to a house that has begun to remember. Elmwick Manor had always carried the weight of history, of course, but in these final days of October, its memory had become less passive, more precise. It no longer merely hinted at the past, it invited it back inside. Miss Marple, ever attuned to such atmospheres, did not resist the change. She had known, almost from the moment she arrived, that the truth behind the crooked candlesticks would never shout. It would whisper, faintly, through walls too thick to yield to anything but time and patience. And so it was with very little surprise, but no less gravity, that she found herself again in the attic. The morning had been grey, the light from the east veiled in cloud. The manor, stripped now of even the pretense of routine, had grown quiet, not restful, but watchful. Eliza was confined to her room under the doctor's strictest orders. Reverend Vale had not returned since his vague, reluctant conversation about Clara and Agatha. Agatha was at present in the conservatory, watching the wind move the dead leaves along the gravel path like letters no one dared retrieve. Miss Marple ascended to the attic with deliberate step. This time, She was not looking for wax. She was looking for words. It was the bureau in the far corner that caught her eye. A small writing desk, Victorian, with a warped leg and tarnished handle. Atop it, a dust-laden typewriter sat askew, as though it had been abandoned mid-sentence. She opened the central drawer, then the one beneath, and at last found what she had sensed was waiting for her. A narrow box, wrapped in cloth, tied with brittle twine. She untied it without hesitation. Inside, letters, some yellowed, others still pale with age, but untouched by time's more aggressive edits. A few bore stamps that suggested international origin, France, Switzerland, one, oddly, from Cornwall, but none had ever been posted. Most were addressed only by name, and many not at all. She read through them with the detachment of a surgeon, each page a careful incision into the past, and it was in this reading that the first great fracture revealed itself, not in Clara, not in the Candlesticks, not even in the chapel, but in Julian. Julian Trenwith, whose name had been written in the family Bible so neatly, had not been born to Agatha. He had been taken in quietly, discreetly, after what was only ever called the scandal. No names, no dates. But in one letter, folded twice and sealed with wax now cracked from age, a single sentence. I know you cannot bear children, and yet fate has delivered one to you. All the same, he is quiet. He does not ask questions. Perhaps in your house, he will remain that way. Miss Marple read the line 3 times, then set the letter aside. Another envelope contained only a page and a half, clearly written in haste, the ink smudged, the words pressed deep into the paper. Julian says the girl keeps calling for the candle. I told him not to speak of her, not in this house, not again, but he says she visits him, that she's angry, he took her place. Another letter, unsigned, simply asked, does he remember the game? The game. Miss Marple blinked, and then she recalled the candle game. Eliza had mentioned it in a fevered murmur days earlier, but now here it was, again, preserved not as memory, but as evidence. A child's game, punishment, disguised as play. One child blindfolded, another tasked with telling the truth, and the third to hold the flame, to test the nerves, to see who flinched, to see who cracked. It was said to have started with Clara, but perhaps it had not ended with her. Miss Marple sat for a long while after reading the letters, letting the attic settle back into its hush, the dust drifting slowly through the shafts of grey light, like particles of forgotten guilt. She did not return the letters to the box, nor did she hide them. She laid them carefully in order, chronological where possible, and placed the box atop the bureau with its lid open, as though daring someone to come looking. There was something about the way the final letter had been worded, clipped, abrupt, almost desperate, that gnawed at her. The implication that Julian had not simply been brought to Elmwick as a mercy, or even as a convenience, but as a replacement. A stand-in, a living shadow. She's angry, he took her place. But who was she? Clara, or someone else? And if Julian had truly understood the implications of his presence in this house, the reason for the coldness behind Agatha's care, the strain in the Reverend's guarded concern, then the question was no longer why he feared the chapel, or the candlesticks, or the wax, but why he had stayed at all. That afternoon, as clouds gathered over Elmwick, a sudden cry echoed from the lower floor. Miss Marple descended with haste, not panicked, but urgent, the way one moves when instinct confirms what logic has only begun to suspect. She found Eliza in the drawing room, crumpled near the fireplace, her palms pressed to the carpet, trailing wax across the floor like bruised ribbons. Her hair was undone, her eyes open, but unfocused, and she gripped something in her hand, not a candle this time, but its remains, melted into her palm like a blistered confession. Miss Marple knelt beside her. Eliza, she said softly, but the girl didn't respond. Agatha appeared moments later, hand to her mouth, then back again to her temple, pacing 3 steps and stopping, as if afraid her own feet might betray her. The Reverend, once summoned, stood by the door like a child waiting for reprimand, offering nothing but a distant quote from Psalms that no one heard. Eliza, Miss Marple repeated, firmer. This time, a whisper. She said it would stop the voices. Miss Marple's gaze hardened, but her voice remained soft. Who? The girl blinked, but no answer came. Later, as the girl slept, made comfortable by a sedative and the warmth of the hearth, Miss Marple sat once more in the study, now dim in the late afternoon. The light fell across the floor in streaks, interrupted by the lace of the windows and the crawling shadow of the grandfather clock. It was then that she noticed a faint stain on the corner of the writing desk, just behind the stack of ledgers and the long-forgotten inkwell, a wax mark, fresh, not candle drip, dragged. She followed the trail with her eyes, then her feet, out of the study, along the corridor, and toward the servants' stairs, leading once more to the attic. Something was waiting. She reached the attic door and paused. The house was silent, not empty, silent, and she opened the door with a careful hand, ascended, and stepped into the dusty half-light. The attic had not changed, at least not visibly. The same trunks, the same wax figures, the same cracked mirror, leaning against the far beam, but something in the air had. It was thicker now, not dust, not cold, something more deliberate, as if the room itself had adjusted in anticipation of her return. Miss Marple moved slowly, each step careful not from fear, but from the necessity of attention. The wax trail led not to the bureau this time, but to the side wall, one rarely visited, where shelves of hat boxes and old stage masks stood in crooked formation, their expressions frozen in comic exaggeration, but behind them, tucked against the beams, was something new. A locket. She recognized it at once. The same locket she had found in the box days ago, only now it was no longer empty. Inside, two faces. One was Clara, the other, a young Julian, not the child of Agatha, not by birth, not by lineage, but perhaps, in some darker way, by inheritance. And next to the locket lay a folded paper, no envelope, no stamp, only a sentence written in cramped, hurried script. She said he had to take her place. That was the rule. The candle doesn't lie. Miss Marple folded the note gently, tucking it into her coat pocket. She turned to leave, and heard the latch click. The attic door, so often groaning open from draught or careless wind, now shut with the firmness of intention. She crossed to it, laid her hand on the knob, turned. Nothing. It was locked, from the outside, and there, in the mirror's edge, she caught it. Not a reflection, but a silhouette. Someone was there, watching, a small figure, barely shoulder height, clad in black, just beyond the threshold. No face, no movement, only watching, and then it too was gone, as if the house had inhaled and held its breath once more. Secrets were meant to be buried, but some keep burning through the floorboards. Subscribe to uncover what waits behind the final locked door, before the light bends again. Chapter 7. Flames in the Attic. It is not uncommon, in old houses like Elmwick Manor, for certain rooms to remember what others are desperate to forget. The attic, after all, is never just a room. It is a threshold, a borderland where dust is memory and shadows do not merely fall, but linger. And as Miss Marple stood in the attic, the door now firmly latched behind her, she did not panic. She did not knock. She simply turned and listened. Because the house was not empty. It was remembering, and it wanted her to remember too. She moved slowly past trunks and broken furniture draped in linen. Her footsteps whispered against the floorboards as she approached a low shelf tucked beneath the gable. The scent of smoke, faint but unmistakable, drew her eye to a leather-bound book, its spine scorched, its edges crumbling. A diary, charred, half-burnt, but not lost. She opened it gently. Inside, page after page of words, written in uneven ink, the handwriting not Julian's, but someone else's, someone younger, unsure, fighting to be remembered. They said I was born second, but I felt it first. I felt the fire, and the wax, and the silence. Another entry. She lights the candle. She tells me to stay behind, but the light bends for me. It doesn't for her. Then Julian isn't like me. He doesn't remember the game, but I do. They said we had to take turns, that only one of us could stay. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly. Each word was a memory trying to breathe through ash. The final entry was written in smudged ink, pressed hard into the paper. She said the candle shows who's real. I told her I'd find my place again. The candlestick points. It always points. She paused, let the quiet settle, and then, without panic, turned to the attic door, locked. But the hinges, old rusting, offered possibility. She examined the latch, too stiff to force open by hand. But nearby, in the base of an old parasol stand, she found a discarded brass rod, part of a coat rack or umbrella handle. She wedged it beneath the bolt, and with quiet strength, twisted until the wood gave with a groan. The latch snapped. The door swung open. The house exhaled. She made no mention of her confinement to Agatha, who that morning had spoken little and avoided Miss Marple's gaze. Eliza remained weak, her hands bandaged, her murmurs incoherent. Reverend Vale was nowhere to be seen. The house had gone into hiding again, but Miss Marple had seen enough. That afternoon, she took a quiet walk through the village, speaking only where it seemed polite, listening more than talking. At the post office, the clerk mentioned, "There was a boy once, but I swear there were two, just for a moment, you know, back when they were born." But then, silence. At the churchyard, the groundskeeper paused over his shears. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said. "Odd, how only one stone bears the name, Julian, but there's space beside it, unused, as if they were waiting or hiding something." The candlesticks had always pointed. Now she understood why. She returned to the chapel by dusk. The sky had turned a dull bronze, the air thick with autumn's last breath. Inside, the crooked candlestick leaned further than ever, almost horizontal now, pointing to a single panel in the southern wall. Miss Marple approached it, laid her hand to the stone, cold, smooth, but hollow behind. A seam in the wall barely visible, unless one knew to look, a false panel, one the family never acknowledged. She did not force it open, not yet, but she stood before it for a long time, then whispered, "You weren't lost, you were left, and they've tried not to see you ever since." The candle flame behind her flickered, the mirror in the corner darkened, and just faintly, she thought, though she did not turn, she heard a small laugh. Some truths hide in plain sight, others bend the light around them. Subscribe before the final candles fade. Miss Marple is closer than ever. Chapter 8. The name in the wall. There is a particular kind of stillness that accompanies withheld memory. Not silence, not peace, but stillness. Heavy, deliberate, like a door that's never quite shut, or a page that someone meant to turn, but didn't. And as Miss Marple stood once again inside the chapel of Elmwick Manor, her hand on the faint seam in the southern wall, she felt not the breathless anticipation of discovery, but the slow ache of something long denied. She had known, even as early as that first walk through the garden, that the candlesticks were not merely symbolic. The crooked stem had bent with intention. It had faced this wall, not for weeks or months, but years, perhaps longer, and no one had dared to ask what it faced. Until now. The stone was smooth at first touch, but yielded ever so slightly when pressed with her gloved fingertips. Beneath it, behind it, was something softer, hollow, hidden, and after a gentle push, and a single, strained exhale from the chapel itself, the panel gave way. A small recess, just wide enough to fit a child, or a secret. Inside, wax drippings, old, blackened, cracked with age, and beneath them, faint etchings, barely visible through soot and candle smoke. Miss Marple leaned in, drew a handkerchief from her pocket, wiped the stone slowly, carefully, in small circular motions, and then, beneath the film of dust and time, she saw it. A name, or rather, the beginning of one, just the initial, nothing more. The rest had been scratched away, violently, repeatedly, as though someone had tried, not only to erase it, but to deny it had ever existed. And below it, carved more faintly, something else. Light bends. She sat back on her heels, hands folded, mind racing, not in haste, but in structure. It was not what she had hoped to find, and yet, it was exactly what she expected. There was no body, no coffin, only memory. And memory, she now understood, had teeth. She replaced the panel with the same care with which she had opened it, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some secrets are not meant to be sealed twice, but nor are they meant to be left exposed. Elmwick's chapel did not tremble, did not weep, but seemed instead to draw back, like a curtain after a performance whose meaning no longer entertained. The air outside had cooled sharply. Miss Marple crossed the garden without haste, the twilight gilding the hedgerows in amber and rust. She did not go directly inside. Instead, she turned down the narrow path beside the chapel wall, the one lined with dormant rosebushes, long since given up their blooms, and followed it until it met the low iron gate that bordered the rectory. The Reverend was standing there already, as though summoned not by telegram, but by instinct. He looked older, more himself, more ashamed. "I know where you've been," he said quietly. Miss Marple offered no reply. He gestured toward a bench beneath a hawthorn tree, and they sat in silence for a moment, before he spoke again. This time, not as a clergyman, but as a man who had once believed in performance, and found himself trapped in its aftermath. "She never forgave herself," he began. "Not Agatha, not Clara, not any of us. We thought it would be nothing, a game, a way to soothe Clara's mind. She was imaginative, even as a child, fragile, but sharp. And when the second child was born, the girl, yes, they didn't give her a name, not publicly, not even in the Bible. She was sickly, quiet, but Clara said she spoke in her sleep, that she remembered things no one had told her." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And what happened to her?" The Reverend's voice dropped. "We were told she had passed, that she'd never fully lived. But I saw her, weeks after, in the chapel, with Clara, lit only by candles. She didn't look dead. She looked waiting, and then, she was gone, and Clara broke. Back in the manor, the fire had been lit but not tended. Shadows danced across the drawing room, in uneven rhythm, as Miss Marple entered. Agatha sat at the piano, not playing, not touching the keys, only staring into the grain of the wood, as though listening for something no one else could hear. Miss Marple did not sit. "Agatha," she said gently, "when did you last see Clara?" Agatha's hand twitched, then stilled. "I was told she was ill, that she was moved to a hospital, quietly, without announcement. That isn't what I asked." A long silence, and then, "I saw her, a year later, in the chapel. She was standing where the candlesticks used to be, holding one, bent toward the floor. She looked at me, and said, 'You replaced me. And what did you do?' I locked the door, and I didn't return. For 20 years, that night, the manor did not sleep. It paused. The house creaked less. The walls breathed quieter. It was not peace, but something like restraint, as though the very stones were bracing for the weight of an old name made new again." Miss Marple remained in the chapel, long after the others had retired. She lit a single taper, not from the altar, but from the reserve cabinet in the vestry, and watched its flame bend against the wall, leaning ever so faintly in the same direction as the crooked candlestick. She followed it once more, back to the panel. She touched it, not to open it again, but to listen, because stone, when carved with memory, carries a frequency beyond words, and there it was, a sound, faint, the shift of something deeper within, not a voice, not a cry, but the absence of silence. She turned, and found Eliza standing in the chapel doorway, pale, barefoot, holding a candle, burning low. "She told me where to stand," Eliza whispered. "She said it would help her remember her name." Miss Marple moved to her calmly. "Eliza," she said, "you knew." The girl nodded once. "I wasn't born here, but I remember, when I came to the house, I saw her, in the mirror. She had my eyes." Miss Marple reached out and gently took the candle from her hand, placing it on the sill. "She had your name too," she said softly. Miss Marple returned to her room in silence. She opened her notebook, wrote only one word, "Clara," and below it one more, Celia. She closed the book, set it beside the candle, and as she extinguished the flame, the mirror beside her fogged from breath that did not come from her. Chapter 9. The chapel's secret room. Some rooms are not meant to be locked. They are simply forgotten, quietly, purposefully, until the silence around them grows so thick it cannot be distinguished from reverence. Elmwick's chapel had one such room, tucked behind its southern wall, concealed by wax and willful memory. It did not wish to be found. But Miss Marple, of course, was not deterred by things that did not wish to be found. She returned in the early light of morning, as dew still clung to the chapel stones and the sun filtered in like cautious fingers. There was no sound, not even birdsong, just the quiet echo of her own footsteps across the tiled floor. She placed her hand once more against the wall. The panel, now familiar to her, gave way with a breath, and she passed through the narrow gap like one slipping into a sealed thought. The chamber beyond was colder than the rest of the chapel, not due to draught, but absence, an airless place. Small, curved, the floor was stone. The ceiling arched just high enough to stand upright. But what it held was what made her pause. A crude altar, no more than a pile of flat stones blackened at the edges. The wax that coated them was thick in places, puddled in others. Dozens of candles had melted here, some recent, some ancient. She knelt before it, not in worship, but in analysis. Upon the altar lay a stack of parchment, bound not with twine, but with faded red ribbon. Each page was thin, faded, theatrical. She unfolded one and read the title aloud, just above a wax-stamped crest: The Elmwick Passion, Private Ceremony, 1935. Below it, a cast of characters. The twin in light, the twin in shadow, the flamekeeper, the witness. She turned another page. A line stood out in careful script: Only wax can tell which soul remains. The lines were not poetry, they were stage directions, chanted lines, ritual instructions, an attempt at mysticism, dressed in amateur theatre, but someone had believed it, or used it. She turned to the corner of the room, where a small cedar box rested atop a stone ledge. She opened it. Inside, candle molds, dozens of them, carved in human forms, rough, featureless, except one. It bore the faint impression of a face. No name, no detail, just two shallow marks, eye sockets, and around the edge of its wax-stained rim, fingerprints. She did not react outwardly. Instead, she folded the papers, closed the box, and left. She took the mould to the young constable, Pritchard, who had already begun to suspect that Miss Marple's quiet walks were more purposeful than she let on. He did the comparison without comment. An hour later, he returned with his cap in hand. "It's a match, ma'am." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He added, awkwardly, "Reverend Vale's prints from that teacup, same ridge structure, same size." She thanked him and returned to the rectory. Reverend Vale was in his study, not reading, not writing, simply sitting. When she entered, he didn't rise. "I imagine you've come about the wax." She sat across from him. "You left it behind. It was meant to be forgotten. Was it you who sealed the chamber?" "No. It was already closed when I arrived, but I found it, and I used it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Why?" He took a moment. Then quietly, "To frighten Clara. Or so I told myself. To keep her from falling deeper into those performances. We thought, if we gave it structure, if we made it a script, she'd lose interest. She didn't. Julian found it." The Reverend's jaw clenched. "Yes. Not long ago, he confronted me, said the past belonged to him too, that he wanted the full truth. And you refused. I paid him to stay quiet. For how long? Until he brought up the mould." That evening, Miss Marple returned to the chapel once more. The crooked candlestick still pointed to the wall. She opened the panel again, stood before the altar, and placed the mould on its center. Then she lit a single candle. Its flame bent toward the wall behind the altar, not the first wall, but a second one, recessed, and there, scrawled into the soot-blackened stone, was a single name. Vale, not written by the Reverend, written by someone else, and not as a tribute, but as an accusation. The flame flickered. She turned. Chapter 10. A sermon in smoke. The air behind the chapel had always been colder, but never cleaner. It held onto smoke, into whispers, into the unwashed breath of generations. The low hedge path that ran behind the southern arch was one few walked anymore. Its brambles curled upward like quiet fingers, and the ivy along the stone made no effort to let go. It was here that Reverend Vale chose to speak, not in his study, not by the fire, but in the hush of early dusk, beneath the half-dead trees and the last call of migrating rooks where the shadows could not lie. Miss Marple walked beside him, her pace deliberate, her silence composed, not out of judgment, but out of invitation. "I was young," he began, voice low but steady. "Not by age, by conviction. That's worse, I think. To believe too easily." She said nothing. Clara was the one they gathered around, though they never admitted it. The family said she was bright, sensitive, but the truth is, she terrified them, not with what she said, though that was part of it, but with how easily they believed her. The path ended at a moss-covered bench where no one had sat in years. They did not sit. "There was a performance," he said. 1935. The Elmwick Passion. I helped plan it, called it spiritual theatre. A chamber ritual, nothing more. We used candles, incantations, staged crossings. Clara was only a child, but she wanted to lead. Miss Marple tilted her head. She lit the candle, he continued, stood inside the circle. We asked her to name the person watching from the other side. It was a game, a trick, but then the wax collapsed. It fell, and the flame caught her hand. He looked down. She didn't scream. She looked at me, said, "I see myself," and after that, she hardly spoke at all. "And you thought silence was recovery?" Miss Marple said. "No, I thought it was possession." They stood in silence. "I asked them to stop the ceremonies," he said. "But the family wouldn't. They locked her in the chapel once, for a night, said it would restore her discipline." Miss Marple raised her eyes. She was 10. He nodded, faintly. "And Julian, he was a boy then. He saw, heard, more than we knew." Miss Marple spent the rest of the evening alone in the drawing room, reading by candlelight. Outside, wind moved the ivy like restless thoughts. Inside, the shadows pooled in the corners of the walls, but never crossed the threshold of the fire. By midnight, she returned to the chapel. The stone was cold. The candle had not been lit since her last visit, but the wax remained, dried across the altar floor, still shaped to where Julian had been found. The trail had hardened, but beneath its glossy surface, there were imperfections, air pockets, sediment, and something else. She knelt, used her gloved hand to lift the edge of one hardened sheet, and there it was, a handprint, pressed not by accident, but firmly, decisively, as if someone had pushed. It was not Julian's hand, not Vale's, not Eliza's. It was smaller, wider, different. She made a cast of it, pressing soft parchment and clay into the wax, preserving the ridges before the chapel could hide it again. As she stood, the candle flickered in the corner. No wind, no footsteps, just that soft sway, and the quiet breath of stone that never forgot what it saw. Back in her room, she compared the impression. It did not match the Reverend's. It did not match hers. She folded the parchment, slid it into her diary, and wrote below it, "One truth left unspoken, and it's waiting for her." She closed the book, blew out the candle, and in the mirror opposite her bed, for just a moment, only the faintest second, she saw Julian, not as a man, as a boy, standing behind her, smiling, and gone. Chapter 11. Ashes for a twin. The mornings at Elmwick had grown colder, though the frost never quite touched the grass. It hovered, instead, above the hedges, at the rim of the chapel roof, inside the windows where breath no longer misted. The manor, was not grieving. It was remembering, and Miss Marple, too, remembered. Every print, every trace, every line, spoken by those who claimed not to know how far their hands had reached into the past. She had already confirmed that the wax handprint taken from Julian's chest did not match Reverend Vale's. She had suspected as much. His guilt lay elsewhere, in silence, in inaction, in the eager shaping of theatre into theology. But this touch, pressed firmly into the cooling wax, belonged to someone else. And that someone, she was now certain, had never left the house. She returned to the drawing room early that morning, not to investigate, but to listen. The fire had been lit, poorly, too much coal, not enough wood. It hissed with effort, but Miss Marple was not looking at the hearth. She was looking at the ashes. Fire, after all, is no more final than dust. And Elmwick's fireplace, unlike most, had not been cleaned since the week of Julian's death. She took the poker and sifted gently through the coal's soft grey cloak. Beneath the char and cracked cinders, she found something irregular, flat, pale, curled along the edges like a burnt petal. She lifted it gently with silver tongs. Only half remained. But the ink had not run. It had seared. One phrase survived. It was never Clara. That's the name they gave her. But she had another before she disappeared. I couldn't bear to write it then. But you know it, don't you? It's yours too. No signature, only an initial, at the bottom right corner. See. She turned the page over. Blank. The reverse had no address, no date, no seal. It had been hidden, not mailed, not given. And someone had tried to erase it by fire. She folded it once, gently, and placed it in the envelope marked simply, "Things they tried to burn." The manner had a habit of stirring the unconscious. Things unsaid often chose midnight to speak, and Miss Marple, who had made a quiet study of silence, had learned to pay attention not only to what was spoken in daylight, but what slipped out between dreams. Eliza, who had not left her bed for 3 days now, lay half-curled beneath a heavy quilt in the small guest chamber above the kitchen. The doctors had offered their conclusions: exhaustion, nerves, hysteria, perhaps a temporary break. But Miss Marple knew that Eliza was not broken. She was remembering. Miss Marple sat beside her, knitting in hand, not for need, but for patience. And at 2:30 in the morning, with the wind nudging the window panes like fingers that had lost their strength, Eliza began to murmur. At first it was nonsense, half sounds, an old lullaby. Then words. She wanted the name back. Miss Marple paused her needles. She never had it, but it was hers. A silence. Then "Don't let them make me disappear again." And finally, "Sister." Miss Marple's hands stopped. Eliza's voice had gone faint, soft, frayed, but there was no mistaking the word. Sister. Not miss, not madam, sister. And then sleep again, real sleep this time. The kind that follows unburdening. Miss Marple leaned back slightly. She did not rise. She only whispered, almost to herself, "No one disappears twice, not while I'm here." She did not sleep that night. Instead, she returned to her room and opened the drawer containing the wax impressions. There were now 4, one hers, one Vale's, one Julian's, and one unknown. She placed the last of them gently on the desk, then rose, and turned toward the corridor. It was nearly dawn when Miss Marple returned to the east corridor, the one rarely used, the one where the walls sloped just slightly, as if the house itself leaned inward to listen. She moved without hesitation, without lantern. She knew the turns by now. Halfway down the corridor hung a painting, faded landscape, anonymous countryside, distant steeple, barely taller than the trees. No name, no frame worth keeping. Just another relic on a wall that had stopped trying to explain itself. But she had passed it before, too many times. And each time, she had noticed something off, not in the painting itself, but behind it. She reached out, took both sides of the frame, and lifted. It came away easily. The wall behind it was bare stone. No wallpaper, no plaster, just grey lime mortar that had once held up prayers and secrets. And there, in the centre, no larger than a tea saucer, was a handprint, wax, soft, fresh. Miss Marple did not speak. She reached forward, lightly touched its edge with the tip of one gloved finger, still pliable, still warm, but impossible. No candle had been lit here, no mould had been used, it had been placed, deliberately. A message, perhaps, or a warning. The print was smaller than the one from Julian's chest, childlike, not pressed in panic, pressed in presence. It had not always been there, which meant it had returned. And as she lowered the painting, restoring it to the wall, she turned to the empty corridor behind her. Chapter 12. Smoke and mirrors, reconstruction is not performance, though it often wears the same mask. When Miss Marple requested the chapel for herself, for just one evening, no one argued. Not Agatha, whose silence had grown too old to unlearn. Not Reverend Vale, whose complicity had already begun to rot into guilt. And not Eliza, who moved now through the manor, not as a maid, but as a shadow, her presence weightless, her eyes distracted by echoes. Only she could hear. Miss Marple had asked for nothing extravagant, only that the candlestick be returned to its original place, the pews undisturbed, and the doors barred from interruption until the hour passed. No lanterns, no stage lights, just wax, just silence. And so, at dusk, the hour Elmwick reserved for revelations and charades alike, she stood before the altar, candle in hand, flame tilted to the windless hush. This chapel, she began, her voice calm, was never a place of faith. It was always a theatre, a place where guilt could wear costumes, where memory could hide in scripts, where people could pretend that the past, if lit correctly, might look like truth. She turned slowly, facing each of them. Eliza, if you would, please, by the door. The girl obeyed, but her hands trembled. Agatha, to the front pew. The matriarch did not flinch. Reverend, if you'll stand by the altar, just here, where you once helped the play begin. He moved slowly. Miss Marple walked the aisle, letting the candle guide her. We are told that Julian died alone, that the wax was an accident, that the flame was unobserved. But that isn't true. Nothing in this house is ever unobserved. She gestured to the crooked candlestick. It bends not because of heat, not because of time, but because someone bent it, someone who remembered what it pointed to, who needed it to face a specific truth, someone who had played this scene before. Eliza exhaled sharply. Miss Marple turned to her. You didn't mean to hurt him, she said. The chapel fell still. You were reliving something, not as you are now, but as you were then, 10 years old, standing where Clara stood, where you once stood. Eliza's eyes grew distant. You weren't Eliza then, Miss Marple continued. You were her, Clara, the girl forgotten in the family Bible, hidden behind the name of a housemaid, buried not in the ground, but in guilt. Agatha's breath caught. Miss Marple turned toward her. And you, she said gently, didn't erase her. You protected her, even when she forgot who she had been. You gave her work, routine, silence. But silence doesn't erase memory. It stores it. The Reverend looked down at his hands. I helped design the play, he murmured. I helped shape the lines. We said it was harmless, but she believed it. And once belief takes hold. Miss Marple approached the altar. She never stopped performing, she said softly, because no one ever told her she could leave the stage. Then, to Eliza again. You found Julian in the chapel. He was reading Clara's scripts, asking questions. You weren't Eliza when you saw him. You were Clara, the girl whose candle had once burned the wrong way. Eliza trembled. I don't remember it, she said. You weren't meant to, Miss Marple replied. You were protecting her, Agatha whispered suddenly, as if admitting it for the first time. I was trying to save what was left. No, Miss Marple said gently. You were trying to undo what had already happened. And then, from the wall behind the altar, a sound, not loud, not sudden, just the sound of something soft against stone. Miss Marple turned and saw it. Another handprint, smaller than the first, pressed into cooling wax on the chapel's rear pillar, fresh, still soft, still holding its shape. No one had entered the room, and yet someone had left a message. Miss Marple did not speak. She only turned to the others and said, "There is still one truth left unspoken, and it is waiting for her." She placed the candle on the altar, stepped back, and let the flame do the rest. Chapter 13. The shape beneath the wax. The wax had not dried. That, more than anything, unsettled her. It had not hardened, had not sealed, had not cooled into memory. It still glistened faintly in the candlelight, soft, as if touched only moments before. Miss Marple stood at the rear wall of the chapel, candle in one hand, lens in the other, leaning forward just slightly toward the pillar where the child-sized handprint remained. No draught stirred the wax, no tools had been laid out, and no one had entered behind her. And yet, the mark was there, not shaped by fear, but by presence. She examined it without touching. The lines were shallow, but intentional, each ridge symmetrical, the span of the palm no wider than a teacup saucer, the fingers thin, delicate, pressed, not as though clawing for attention, but resting, as if in acknowledgement. A trace, a ghost with fingerprints. And in that moment, Miss Marple no longer asked how. She asked who was meant to find it, and why now. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she returned to the vestry with her lamp and began gently tapping the wall nearest the handprint's shadow, hollow, just slightly, a difference in tone beneath the stone. She pressed her palm flat, then felt it give ever so slightly inward, a panel, hidden, not with hinges, but wax, melted, smeared across the seam, like a forgotten seal. She took the candle and passed its flame across the joint. Slowly, the wax loosened, peeled, cracked, and there, tucked behind the smallest cavity in the chapel wall, was a folded envelope, sealed again in wax, but old, dusty, untouched. She broke the seal, unfolded the parchment inside, and read only 3 words, scrawled in the handwriting of someone either young or breaking. Her name was Celia Trenwith. Miss Marple closed her eyes. There it was, the name buried, not Clara, not Eliza, Celia. And underneath it, another slip of paper, clumsier, torn from a child's notebook. Don't forget her, even if she forgets herself. The candle trembled, or perhaps her hand did. She folded the pages, stepped away from the wall, and as the wax on the wall behind her cooled and dried, the air inside the chapel no longer felt still. It felt paused, as if waiting. Miss Marple did not speak of the name, not immediately, not to Agatha, not to Vale, not even to Eliza herself. Names, after all, are delicate things. When forgotten, they harden. When remembered, they ache. And in Celia's case, it was not just a name that had been hidden, but an entire identity folded away, like a letter too painful to open. And yet, something had shifted. Eliza began to stir from her silence, not with words, but gestures. At breakfast, she paused at the window longer than usual, pressing her hand to the glass as if measuring its shape. In the hallway, she hesitated, beneath the portrait of a young girl no one had mentioned in years, and in the garden, she spoke without prompt, softly, absently, to no one. The candle was crooked then too. Miss Marple heard it, the tone, not present, not performative. Memory. That afternoon, Miss Marple found her in the chapel again, alone. Eliza stood before the altar, not close, not touching, just near enough that her shadow reached the first pew. The air inside was warmer than before, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She waited. Eliza reached forward, touched the wax pool at the base of the candlestick. Then she whispered, "He wasn't meant to read it." A pause. "He asked me why I wrote the ending that way." Another pause. "But I didn't write it." "She did." Miss Marple took a step forward. "Eliza, she said gently. Or should I say, the girl turned, but her eyes were unfocused. I don't remember, she said. You're remembering now. Eliza blinked. The weight of it landed, not like a blow, but like a reunion. Tears came, slow, soundless, and she whispered, Celia. Miss Marple said nothing. There was nothing to add, only to witness, and at last, to allow her to stand not in someone else's place, but in her own. It was not unusual for Miss Marple to leave her door unlocked in a house like Elmwick, where secrets came not in footsteps, but in reflections. Locks offered little defense. Still, she paused at her threshold that night, not because something was out of place, but because nothing was, and that, in itself, was wrong. She stepped inside. The candle by her bedside had not been touched. The curtains had not been drawn. The window latch was still secure, but on the desk, beside her journal, was a sheet of parchment, curled slightly at the edge. Blank, and next to it, wax, not spilled, not dropped, pressed. Another handprint, smaller than Julian's, smaller than Vale's, not hers, but not a child's, either, something in between. The wax still held its shape, still bore the ridges of a fingertip, almost hesitant, almost gentle, not an intrusion. A message. She did not move. She did not breathe. She simply stared. Then slowly, with her gloved hand, she took her own journal. She opened it to a blank page. Beneath the word Celia, she wrote a single line. She remembers more than she should, but not everything she must. She closed the journal, snuffed the candle, and left the handprint untouched. The chapter 14, where the wax leads the wax, had not cooled. Even now, hours after the house had settled, and the last footstep had faded, it still gleamed faintly beside her writing desk. Not glossy, not fresh, but unwilling to forget. It held the memory of the hand that placed it, just as the house, in its quiet cruelty, held the shape of every secret it had swallowed. Miss Marple stood beside it, not in fear, but in quiet comprehension. The message had not been left in malice. It had been a map. She lit her lamp and followed, not hurriedly, not blindly, but with the certainty that some paths must be walked alone. Down the hall, past the cracked portraits of ancestors who had watched the house decay from within. Down the narrow back stair, past the parlour, where Eliza, Celia, had once wiped wax from her fingers without knowing why. Into the chapel, where nothing had moved. But the wax was waiting. A trail, not poured, pressed, little beads of wax, aligned deliberately, each one no bigger than a thumbprint, some warped, some cracked, but all facing the same direction, toward the altar, then left, to the southern wall, and down. A seam in the stone that had not been there yesterday, new, or long forgotten. She knelt, ran her fingers along the groove, cold, then a faint indentation, a latch. She pressed it, and the stone gave way, not all at once, but in a reluctant sway, like a secret changing its mind. The air beyond was colder than the chapel, colder, and somehow older. She lifted the lamp, and descended the narrow stair. The staircase was not long, but it twisted, built not for procession, but for concealment. The walls curved inward, as if unwilling to let her pass, and the lantern's glow touched only what was absolutely necessary. The air smelled of damp earth and melted paraffin, and somewhere below her, something flickered, not her flame. Another. She reached the base of the stair. The crypt opened before her, not in grandeur, but in intimacy. The room was small, rounded, a chamber carved by hands that had not expected visitors. No stone coffins, no bones, no dust, just childhood. A small rocking chair, too small now for anyone living. A locket, broken at the clasp. A stuffed lamb, threadbare, one button eye missing, and beside it, on a low wooden table that could only have been built for a girl no older than 10, a candle, lit, burning straight. No draught, no sound, no explanation. And beside the flame, an envelope, folded, unsealed. She approached it with care, hands steady, breath level. The chair, the locket, The lamb. These were not relics left behind. They had been preserved, tended to. Someone had come here before her, not years ago, not weeks ago. Tonight, she stood still, not in shock, nor dread, but in consideration. The candle, on the small table, burned cleanly, with no sputter, no lean. The wax had only just begun to run down the sides, measured in minutes, not hours. Whoever had lit it had not meant to stay. The envelope beside it remained untouched. Her fingers reached for it slowly, brushing against the edge. The paper was warm. Not from the candle, from a hand. She opened it. Inside, only a few lines, written in a trembling script that wavered between adult structure and a child's uncertain spacing. She never wanted to forget, but they made her, and now she remembers too much. Below that, no signature, only a single fingerprint in wax, pressed into the lower corner of the page. She compared it to the others, not Julian's, not Eliza's, not Celia's, smaller, thinner, delicate, new. The kind of print left by someone who does not wish to be noticed, but wishes very much to be found. She stepped back, lifted the lantern higher. Its glow swept across the crypt wall and revealed something else. A second candle, unlit, still waiting. Beside it, the outline of a shoe print in dust, smaller than her own. No drag, no hesitation, and it led out, back up the stairs, toward the house. Miss Marple turned, slowly, lifted the lantern again, and though the stair behind her was empty, she did not feel alone, not watched, accompanied. Chapter 15. Night falls on Elmwick. The chapel had been locked, not with ceremony, not with fanfare, no closing hymn, no village notice, just the quiet groan of old hinges and the turn of a key that had once kept out drafts, but had, for years, let in too much else. Miss Marple watched from the upper window of her guest room. There was no crowd, no curious eyes, only a single groundsman who did not look behind him as he walked away. Clara. No, Celia now, as the papers at last reflected, had left the house the morning after the candle burned alone in the crypt. There had been no police escort, no ambulance, no scandalized crowd. She had been guided gently into the rear seat of a private car, with grey upholstery and windows that misted from within. The woman who once pressed wax into stone now sat with her hands folded in her lap, wrapped in the same shawl she had worn since childhood. She said only one thing, as they pulled away. He was kind. He never shouted. I only wanted him to stop reading. And then she was gone. The gravel did not settle for some time. Agatha Trenwith, who had once ruled the manor with the iron quiet of a matriarch who believes herself untouched by time, did not appear at the door to watch her ward go. She remained in the drawing room, alone, the curtains drawn, a single suitcase by her feet. When she did leave, it was in a cab with no destination offered aloud. The porter took her case without question. She did not say goodbye. She had aged in silence, not physically, but as though memory had finally overtaken her will to refuse it. The house did not call her back. It simply let her go. Reverend Vale stayed, not as a figure of the parish, but as a man in retreat. He handed his resignation to the bishop's assistant without need for confession or protest, and moved into the old caretaker's cottage by the orchard wall. Miss Marple saw him once that week, bareheaded, standing beneath a half-blooming apple tree, staring upward, not with shame, but a kind of quiet disbelief, as if only now understanding what his words had helped shape. Miss Marple, too, began to pack. Not quickly, and not because she was eager to go, but because endings should not be delayed once they arrive. She folded each item carefully, placing the wax impressions in a lined wooden case, her notes in 3 stitched volumes, and her final thoughts on Elmwick in the pages of a 4th. There is no such thing as silence in a house that remembers. There are only pauses between recognitions. She paused by the window one last time. The chapel door held firm. The manor stood very still, and for the first time since her arrival, there was no echo in the hall. She would have left quietly. She intended to, but at just past 5:30, that final evening, as the sun cast long gold streaks across the hallway floor, and her trunk was closed but not yet latched. There was a knock, soft, 3 times. She opened the door. A child, perhaps 8, perhaps 9, cap askew, mismatched buttons, a scuffed satchel hanging off one shoulder. He stood there with all the innocent gravity only country children carry, as if he were reporting on the weather, but might equally be delivering a prophecy. He looked up. "My mum says something's wrong with the well behind our house." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "She says it moans at night." She looked at him. He did not blink, and after a brief moment of silence, one that felt neither empty nor expectant, she smiled, softly. "Show me." And so he turned, and Miss Marple followed. If you've enjoyed this full-length mystery, and wish to follow Miss Marple into her next strange village tale, remember to subscribe. Sometimes the next shadow appears before the last one fades.